Hi everyone. Our lesson this week is nature close-ups, and I'm going to suggest leaves or feathers. If you'd like to do a seashell, that's another possibility, but I think right now leaves, as we're entering fall, it's something to think about. So here's some examples of some finished demos I'd done in the past. And on this one, I have a really dark background where I sprinkled some salt. And you can see some wet into wet right here and here. On this one, I scraped while it was still damp and the veins got dark. You can see that right here. And these will be photographs that will be attached to the Google Classroom too, so if you want to see them up close. Here's a geranium. If you want to do it in a pot, it's up to you how you do the composition. One of these days I'll show you how to do those little dewdrops. They're not hard at all. Maybe we can do it on the Zoom. And then once in a while you'll run into leaves that have really light veins. So, there's different ways to do it. You can lift, you can scrape. A really nice way is to paint in between, do a base coat, and then on the second layer go a little darker and just paint between, leaving those empty. That's what I did on these two. On this one I used some masking fluid. And here they are again. This one I talked about like a crayon resist. Here's masking fluid, here's scraping. And this again is putting that base coat down and then painting a darker area around to leave the lighter veins showing. Now this one's got this nice geometric background, and I used plastic wrap to get those textures. So if you want to have fun with a border or a background that's geometric, you can do that also. Here's some little sketchbook pieces that I did. Just while I was on vacations or visiting places or just going outside. And a lot of times I like to use the Pit pen to go over the drawing. On this composition, you will notice, and on some of the others that I just showed you, overlapping is something to consider. It kind of helps give it depth. And then also the cast shadow is nice. Here's that cast shadow. It makes it feel like it's lifted off the page and it makes it feel more 3D. A lot of times in my sketchbooks, I will write to explain what was going on. I'll put the location and the date. And you can see I did a little spattering at the end. Spattering with salt, spattering with paint. And this is nice because it's breaking out of the border. I created a border and you can see it kind of breaking out of it, which is fun. And here's a sketchbook where I've created little areas to do different leaves. So that's something you could consider too. Instead of having a traditional composition, maybe do sections. And you can even do it without having to use the ink. Here's another one. And on this, you can see the really dark background that I used to make the lighter leaves begin to pop out. This is kind of interesting because on these geraniums, often you'll see that reddish area coming through, and you can use a wet into wet. I'll go grab a geranium so you can see. This would be an example of that kind of leaf, and it almost actually looks like it's a wet into wet on the actual leaf. Because red and green are complementary colors, you'll get it, the red will get a little more brown and muted. So that's a fun thing to do. And most everybody has geraniums somewhere in their home or their yard or their neighborhood. So if I have a couple minutes, I might go ahead and demonstrate that on one of these geraniums. So I added on the Google Classroom a little video on contour drawing for those of you that are unfamiliar, or if you just want a little review. We did leaves this past week for my drawing class, and this was a demonstration I did, only we were using graphite. So this was a photograph I took under a strong light, so you can see the cast shadows were nice on that. And so what I was showing them is when you first start out on your composition, you can do what's called a gesture drawing for placement. Just kind of, and I would be working on a piece of newsprint and then transfer it. You don't have to do that, but that helps you get the placement and the proportion. So then on top of that gesture drawing, you can do your contour drawing, and then you can lay it on top of your Good Arches watercolor paper, tape it on, put the graphite paper in there, and begin to go over it with a red pen, just like we've done in the past. So I even did a little drawing of where the cast shadow was going to be. And you can work directly from real leaves, or if you take a photograph and print it out, that's fine too. But you want to really have something to observe. And it's best if you're looking at real objects that you've found, or a photograph of a real object that you've done, rather than off the internet. So I grabbed some different kinds of leaves, and I tried to play around with arranging them in a way that I thought was nice. Maybe a little bit of overlapping. I think I decided that would be a good overlap. And before I actually did it on this paper, I tried a composition on the newsprint, and rather than transfer it, I just went ahead, once I was happy with that, I went ahead and laid each leaf down separately and drew it. So on this one, what I saw from my vantage point was a little twist in the actual leaf. And on this one, now this one will have some tiny little edges, so I would create that with the brush and the paint. You don't have to necessarily draw it that way, but a lot of it is done directly with the paint. And then this one will be here. This one, you could see a possibility of some nice wet into wet going on here. Maybe an underpainting of yellow first. And then finally this one has got some definitely light veins on the leaves. So I could use masking fluid by dipping the masking fluid in the pen and drawing it out and protecting the white of the paper that way, or using one of the masking fluid markers, or I could do a base coat and then go in and put and then just paint in between all these veins, or scrape them. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. I'm not going to do a whole complete painting because I also want to show you a little bit about feathers. But now that I've drawn these, or at least drawn them a little bit, I'm going to lift up some of that graphite so it's not so dark. Oops. Sorry about the wiggling. I'm trying to, there we go. Trying to find my location here. All right. So let's go ahead and do this one first. And when you're thinking about greens, we've got some greens on my palette. I've got sap green. I've written them down again. I've got, this is spring green, which I really love. Sap green, phthalo green, and viridian up here. So those are nice greens, but I always like mixing the colors with the yellows and the blues. So in fact, I'm going to actually do glazing where I'm going to put down a base coat of yellow first, and rather than leave this pure white on the veins, I'm going to go with a yellow. So I'll grab my brush. I'll get a fairly large medium brush, and so this is the one I'm going to do. I've got a test strip handy. There's my yellow. And I don't want it to be really, really bright yellow. So I might neutralize it just a little bit with some purple. And over here is Rose of Ultramarine. I've got Permanent Violet. So I'll put a little Permanent Violet down there. And maybe just dab a little bit on there. You see how right away that has neutralized that yellow because it's the complementary color of it. I keep knocking the tripod. I'm in a pretty tight space here. So I'm going to go ahead. Oh, and I wanted this leaf to overlap that. So I got to remember not to paint that part. So I'm going to give it a base coat. I could be using a larger brush, really. I've got this nice big round one. This is like a Goliath or a golden fleece round is from Cheap Joe's. This happens to be a number 32, so it's a big one. I'm getting a smaller brush. Be careful not to go right to the corner there. I don't want to lead the viewer right into the corner. So we'll let that kind of sit for a minute and dry. And then I'll go in and try and do the same thing on this leaf. And on this one, I might go ahead and put the red or the purpley red while it's still wet, because it has that wet into wet look. Oh, here's quinacridone gold. That's a nice one. I should probably use that. That would be great. And we'll see how this works. I'm going to leave a little space here for the overlap because that's still wet. I don't want it to run in there. So I'll get Permanent Rose ready here. And it will maybe even add a little blue to purplize it a little bit. Purplification. See how it's pretty brown. It's actually an old dried leaf that I've had. When I go on vacation, a lot of times I'll pick up leaves and flatten them in my sketchbook and take them home. Okay, this is still pretty wet, but let's give it a try. And maybe even get a little bit smaller brush. No guarantees this will work. And it'll all be on video for eternity if it doesn't. So I'm just following where the red is as I look at it. And I'll give the edges a little bit of that spiky look. Looks like it might be working. And when you find leaves, it's okay if they're a little bit beat up or there's some wormholes in them or some caterpillar holes or something isn't quite perfect. That's what makes it more interesting. And I'm going to leave a little bit of that vein showing there. I think you'll have fun. And you don't have to do a whole page of leaves. It'd be fun just to do a single leaf on a smaller piece of paper and have it, you know, make it into a little greeting card or a tiny mini painting. It's kind of nice. You don't feel as intimidated if you just do a small one. Okay, I'm going to take the brush, and it's a pointed brush, and I'm just going to try and do, let's see, a little delicate stem there. So I think that works pretty good. Yeah, I like that. And so I could go on to the others, but let's go back and let me give this just a little zap with the blow dryer just to make sure it's dry. Hopefully I won't knock my it's on my camera's up there on a big tripod, and I'm sort of hovered inside here. Yeah, for this part I want it to be really dry because on this I want to have pretty distinct veins. And maybe, I mean, I wouldn't do this if I were you, but on this one leaf, maybe I'll try scraping on one part of it and doing the negative painting, so to speak, on the other part of it. So I'm gonna clean my brush and let's clean that off. So I want a fairly bright green. So I'm going to use manganese blue or peacock blue. So more of a turquoisey blue with my yellow. Also, because there is yellow, and you know, this is another aspect that I should be thinking about here. Because it has yellow already, I don't have to make it a real greeny color. It can be more of a turquoisey green. And then it will mix, if I put this as a transparent wash, it'll mix with the yellow that's down there. So let's do this part as negative painting right here. It looks pretty turquoisey, but I'm going to have a little faith that as it dries, it's going to turn more green as it mixes with the yellow that's underneath there. So here's how those light veins then are showing through here. Now on this section, let's try it where, and I think it's turning into a decent green. Make it a little darker. So negative painting, you have to think backwards. It helps if you have some guide there with the pencil to help you out, but that's another technique. So just to show you this, and I wouldn't do this on one leaf and if I was really doing a keeper painting, but since this is a demo, I'm going to go ahead and let's get a little bit more here. I'm going to add a little ultramarine blue too to make it a little darker. Okay, so I'm going in and on this one, I'm just going to paint the whole section here, leaving that little middle part. And I probably should be using a bigger brush. Okay, it's getting to the magic moment now where the shine is almost gone. So I don't want to do it when it's really wet, but I don't want it to be bone dry either. So I'm going to see if I can follow that vein. And if it's dry enough, then it won't run back in. If it's really wet, it's going to run back in and you won't see it as a light vein. This one's still pretty wet, so it's almost turning, if it's really wet, it'll turn into a dark vein because the paint will run back in. So now I'm going to sort of draw with my X-Acto or with my palette knife. You can also use a cut up credit card. To get the same effect of scraping. And really study how the veins are configured. Don't take anything for granted. You think you know, but when you really start to study it, you'll see things. So there's two different techniques on one leaf. And again, I wouldn't suggest you do that, but for purposes of this demo, I think that will work. Okay, so I'm going to put this away now, and I just want to show you on this how I would do this geranium wet into wet. So I'll mix up my green again. And I don't have a reference, but I'm just gonna figure I kind of know what's going on here. And you know, another thing too, I should show you this right now, is you can mix your colors wet into wet. Oh shoot. If I can get a non-polluted green here, a red, yellow, excuse me. If I can go in with the yellow, and then while it's still wet, go in with the blue, and you'll have a different way to mix your green instead of mixing it on the palette like I did for the first one, and I really like that effect. So, but on this one I pre-mixed on the palette. I mixed my green, and while it is still wet, I'm going to go in with a bright red, which the geranium really doesn't have. And if we look at this again, it's not a really bright red here. But I'm going to go in and just around the center, I'm going to drop in some red. And you see it's sort of oozing wet into wet, and it creates that look. If you were doing this on your good watercolor paper, you could wait for the magic moment and then scrape those lighter veins in there, as you can see, right through. Okay. So I think that's fun on those geraniums, at least those kind of geraniums. I'm going to put this aside. And then the other thing I wanted to show you on this, and again, I've knocked it. Ugh, everybody's going to get seasick watching this. If you decide you want to put a dark background to emphasize a light leaf, then probably the best thing is to do it wet into wet. So wet your area around it, and then go in with your dark color. I'll use some ultramarine blue and maybe a little bit of red in here. And that really makes that, it doesn't have to all be the same color either. You can keep dipping into a different part of your palette. But a dark background is kind of a nice thing to help make your light colored leaf stand out. And if you wet it first, you won't get these places where it's gotten a hard edge and dried, and you'll have a nice continuity to your background. If you want to create these little backgrounds, you can drop in bits of water when it's half dry, or you could sprinkle a little salt to create a texture. Okay, well, let's move on, and all on the same video, I'm gonna do a little bit of feather work. So we'll put these aside, and grab this. So here's a painting I did of some feathers, and on this one I created a border that the feathers themselves broke out of. If you do want to create a geometric border that you want to have right angles, it's a good idea to have a square or a triangle to give you those right angles, so you can draw it in and then continue to draw around so that it's one continuous rectangle. But I'm going to use similar feathers that I used on this one. I have looks like maybe a barred rock chicken, and this could be a red-tailed hawk maybe. And then I've got a different one here that I don't really know what this is, but I like to find feathers and collect them. So I'm going to put this aside here. And I found a little demo I had already done with a border. And that's kind of a neat thing to create a border. Normally I would do the border last, but on this one I already had it, so I thought I'd use it. And this was done by taping off, taping here and here, and then putting a channel of water and then dabbing different colors in there while it's wet into wet, and even a little salt. And then let that dry, peel it off, and put tape on this one. And so you get this nice rainbow border. You got to be careful that the tape doesn't bleed. You could lift it a little bit if that happens. But again, it's really important to get a right angle so that if you ever want to mat it, the mat's going to have right angles, and it's going to really make the border look crooked if you don't have that. So I've drawn them in a little bit, and I'm going to, again, erase so I don't have it quite so dark. And I'm going to use that similar technique that I used on the feathers, the leaves, with glazing over it. But this time I'm going to add the texture of a fan brush, because that'll give you some of that nice feathery texture on there. So as I look at this, I see an underpainting of maybe an orange. I'm gonna dry this, or I'm gonna clean my palette and get a fresh start here. So I dip my sponge, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm dipping my sponge right in the water and squeezing it out and then wiping it on the palette. So I've got, then I can take a paper towel and just wipe it. So I've got some pretty clean areas now to do some new mixing. And then I'll swap out the water here. Okay, so I'm going to put in that layer of orange. So I'll use New Gamboge and some Scarlet Lake. And it's a little bit bright, so I think I'll add a touch of blue. We'll use a little ultramarine blue to brown it a little bit. I still want it to be in the descriptive word of orange, but not quite so bright. Okay. So I'm putting down a base coat, kind of, and looking at the shape of the main shape of the feather. So even at this point, I could almost use that fan brush right now to get some of this. I'm going to add a little burnt sienna. And maybe I'll dip the fan brush in some blue. Burnt sienna and blue make a nice dark color. And I'll bring in, I'll kind of darken a little bit. So far this has been done wet into wet. Here's another fan brush. Once the fan brush gets wet, the bristles sort of stick together, so you can kind of pull them apart. Okay. Now I can watch for that magic moment again and find my palette knife, which has disappeared. I guess here it is. And maybe be able to put that vein or that center, what would you call that? I don't know, the stem of the feather. But it's that middle part. And since once the shine is gone, I could go in, well, let's have it turn dark. It wasn't quite, it was still a little bit wet up there. So I've indicated that part down the middle. And if I, from my viewpoint, I can see it's light and dark because it's rounded, so you could go back in and round it later. While that's drying, because it has to be dry to put in there, I'm gonna do a little bit on this feather right here. And I've got a fan going up above, so it keeps, let's see, I think I wanted it to be like that. Yeah, so I'll do that. So I think I'm gonna try to do this maybe a little bit more wet into wet. And again, you might want to stick with the same style throughout your painting. So this one wasn't wet into wet, but let's try a little wet into wet on this one. So I'm gonna wet it around this feather, and I'm gonna go in with some oranges, a little bit here. And I'll put a little more blue in it to make it more gray. And on the Google Classroom, I've given you a link to a page that shows different close-ups of nature things. And there's some really nice watercolors of feathers. So you can see all different interpretations. But I kind of like starting like this, and then we can go back in and let me get a tissue. We'll tighten it up, but you have that nice loose start. And then I don't know if you can see, like on this one, can you see that nice, I can see it, but there's a nice, well, let's do it this way. There's a cast shadow. Depends on how the feather is. If you have it so that it's raising up a little bit like it is now, I can see the cast shadow. Okay, so I think this is fairly dry. Let me grab the blow dryer. And there goes the feather. Okay, I'm going to look at this first one again, and I'll do the same kind of thing that I was doing on the leaf. This time I'm going to use ultramarine blue and some of this burnt sienna. Maybe throw in a little alizarin crimson to make it a little more purple. That's kind of nice. I like that. Maybe a little more burnt sienna. So now I'm going to start to show some of the color differentiation. This actually would be really blue here. And then, so that was very dark, and then this will be a little bit lighter, so I'll add a little more water to it. And then I'm just kind of following what those stripes are doing. And so on. So I would do that all the way down. I'm going to show some of that, the difference of how it's sort of separating up there. And then maybe I need my fan brush again. So let's pretend I had done all of that. Then a nice thing at the end is to go in and show you've got the several things going on. You've got the local color, the actual color, like a blue shirt or a green shirt, but then you've got the texture. So we've got the local color of the stripes, but then if you look closely, we have the texture of how the feather is growing out of that main stem. So I'm going to go in and just indicate some of that texture. It's not real obvious, but you want to really study that. And I see it's going like this. So make it kind of subtle. So this could be at the end or even at the beginning. So you've got local color and texture. And then you might also have a cast shadow at the end. If I can find, here's the one I showed you earlier, and you can see that cast shadow on the feathers makes them look like they're trompe l'oeil or fool the eye, like they are very real. And here's that texture that I'm doing right here, right now. Okay, now since this is a white feather, and a lot of it's white, as this one is, you might want to put it on a background, or have at least maybe some of it on the background. Like the border created kind of a background for it. Okay, let's go back into this one, which blew away. And I had it like that. Now I can go in with a finer brush. And indicate that central stem. And let's show a little bit of texture with the fan brush. And notice that the wet into wet went outside of the perimeter, which is kind of cool. Makes it look a little looser. I'll go in and show this edge a little bit more. This is dry now. A little more cobalt blue. It's kind of nice to think about going from general to specific. So we started off real general with that wet into wet. And now I'm kind of adding an over painting of some of the texture right here. Leaving, leave some things to the viewer to interpret. And I like that. Fun. Yeah, I don't like that little part. If ever you do something you don't like, you have a little opportunity with a clean brush to just kind of lift it up. I didn't like how that went. So I kind of like that. And I think if I put a cast shadow underneath, that would really help too. I'm changing this part of the stem of the feather is white, but I'm going to turn it into dark just because I'm not sure what I'm doing with the background yet. Now on this one, since I had already had a border, I was working with a border I had found in my demos. I can't do an overlap unless, we like to cheat. You could paint on another piece of paper, you could paint your feathers, you could cut them out and glue them on. We do this stuff and make it kind of a collage and have it overlapping, and then paint in your cast shadows or whatever. So that's kind of a cool thing to consider too. And don't forget on these feathers, it's hard to see, but can you see that the edges are a little bit rough? So even though I started out by making it a smooth edge, you want to go in and create some more roughness on the edge to show it's not made out of concrete or plastic. Okay, I think that's all. Look on the Google Classroom. I'll have photographs of all these things, and have fun with this. I think you'll like it. Okay. Bye.